Every morning at 4 a.m., while 88 million Iranians slept, the most hunted man on earth opened his eyes inside a compound in central Tehran. And before his feet touched the floor, before he whispered the first word of his prayer, one thought was already waiting for him. Am I going to die today? That thought had lived inside Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's mind every single morning for over 40 years, not as a passing fear, but as a permanent companion. The first thing he carried into the day, and the last thing he held before he closed his eyes at night. He prayed with one arm. His right had been dead since 1981, when a bomb hidden inside a tape recorder exploded inches from his face during a speech at a Tehran mosque. The blast destroyed his arm, scarred his lungs, damaged his vocal cords, and left him with a truth he could never unlearn. Death could come from anywhere, from anyone, at any time. After surviving that explosion, he reportedly told those around him, "I do not need the hand. It is enough if the brain and the tongue work." But what he did not say, what no one around him would ever hear, was that from that day forward, he would never fully trust another human being for the rest of his life. Every room he entered had been swept. Every object placed near him had been inspected. Every person who sat in his presence had been searched. And still, somewhere behind those calm, unblinking eyes, the supreme leader of Iran was always calculating which direction the next attack would come from. Khamenei married Mansoureh Khojaste Bagherzadeh in 1964. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a Mashhad merchant, and his mother had walked to her family's home to ask for her hand in the traditional way. In one of her only known interviews, published quietly in an Iranian magazine in the early 90s, Mansoureh described her role in simple words. She kept the house calm, she raised the children, and when Khamenei was imprisoned under the Shah, she visited him in jail and never once shared her own pain because she believed his burden was already too heavy. She was his wife for 62 years, and in all that time she never appeared at a state event, never gave a public speech, never issued a single statement, becoming the most invisible woman in the Islamic Republic, not because she chose silence, but because silence was the only form of safety the regime could offer the family of its most targeted man. Together they raised 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters, but being the children of the most hunted leader in the Middle East meant that none of them would ever live a normal life. Their movements were permanently monitored, their marriages arranged within the regime's most trusted circles, and their identities kept so hidden that even international media could not agree on all their names. During every military crisis, every Israeli strike, every American threat, every night the skies over Tehran lit up with explosions. Mansoureh and the children were rushed underground with him, sealed into a bunker for days at a time, waiting in silence for someone to tell them whether the man they loved would survive another night. But the family was never allowed to be fully together. During the Iranian retaliatory strikes on Israel in 2024, his son Mojtaba was at his side, but Masoud and Mostafa were kept at separate locations, because the regime had made a calculated decision that no single bomb should be able to erase the entire bloodline at once. Think about what that means. A father who could never have all of his children in the same room at the same time. Not at a holiday, not at a dinner, not even in a crisis, because the system he built to survive had made the simple act of gathering his family a national security risk. By 6 a.m., his chief of staff, Asghar Hijazi, was already seated across from him for the daily security briefing, a ritual that had long stopped being about governance and become about one single question. Where does American and Israeli intelligence think I am right now? 3 mornings a week, his son Mojtaba entered for private meetings, running the political network, managing contact with the Revolutionary Guard. But even this, even a father seeing his own son happen behind inspections, behind guards, behind protocols that treated every visitor, including family, as a potential threat. 14 armed guards stood permanent watch at the entrance to his residence, and every person who crossed the threshold, whether a general, a minister, a cleric, or a relative, was subjected to the same full-body inspection. Because in the world Khamenei lived in, Rank meant nothing, and loyalty was never assumed. His public gatherings were staged like military operations, hand-picked attendees seated in front rows with plainclothes bodyguards planted among them, thermal imaging cameras scanning the audience for concealed weapons or abnormal body heat, because the man addressing the crowd could never be sure that the crowd would not kill him. Every meal inside the compound followed invisible rules. Food preparation was monitored, access to the kitchen was restricted, and nothing reached the supreme leader's table without passing through layers of inspection. Because history had taught Iran that leaders could be killed by what they swallowed just as easily as by what exploded beside them. Provincial trips, once a regular part of his duties, required weeks of advance work before Khamenei ever stepped outside Tehran. Security teams would deploy days ahead to sweep buildings, cordon neighborhoods, lock down rooftops, clear every window within sniper range, until eventually the trips stopped entirely, because no amount of planning could guarantee what the compound walls already provided. Every Wednesday night he dined privately with Ahmad Jannati, the head of Iran's Guardian Council, the same night, the same hour, the same room for years. One of the only routines he allowed himself to keep, perhaps because even a man living inside a fortress needs something that feels like normalcy. He read constantly, poetry, novels, history, scripture, and he had written Persian verse since childhood, a private passion he never abandoned even as supreme leader. But in the final years, the man who once read books on long bus rides across Iran was reading them underground in bunker light, surrounded by concrete walls with no window and no sky. Year after year, as the American and Israeli intelligence machine grew more precise and more patient, Khamenei's world shrank. Public appearances disappeared, Friday prayers were abandoned, stadiums were replaced by sealed rooms, and the supreme leader of 88 million people slowly became a man who ruled the country from behind a door that fewer and fewer people were allowed to open. After Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah in September 2024, dropping 80 bombs on an underground bunker in Beirut and killing the man who had survived in hiding for years, Khamenei understood with cold certainty that the rules had changed and that the same machine was now pointed directly at him. Following the 12-day war with Israel in June 2025, Khamenei abandoned the surface entirely, retreating into a private bunker beneath Tehran connected to a network of interlocking tunnels, taking his wife and closest family into the dark with him and sealing the world above shut. The elevator ride to the deepest chamber took more than 5 minutes, a slow, grinding descent into the only place on earth he believed could not be reached, because his own military officials had told him that only American-made munitions had the power to penetrate that deep. He stopped using all phones, all radios, all digital communication of any kind, issuing commands only through a single trusted aide who carried handwritten notes between the bunker and the surface world, because he had been told that any electronic signal, no matter how brief, could betray his location to the satellites circling above. Israeli officials leaked that his mental state was deteriorating, that his commanders were hiding the truth from him, and that the leader of one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East was now communicating through handwritten scraps of paper like a prisoner passing notes from a cell. His own people began turning against him from the inside. Senior regime figures, businessmen, politicians, and military officers were quietly discussing how to strip him of power. And one insider told The Atlantic that everyone knew his days were numbered, even if he stayed alive. Even his chief of staff, Hijazi, the man who had delivered his security briefing every morning at 6 a.m. for years, was reportedly negotiating in secret with Russian officials to secure an emergency escape route from Iran for himself and his family if the regime collapsed. The man closest to the supreme leader was already planning his exit. Senior officials summoned to see him were transported in blacked-out vehicles and physically blindfolded for the final leg of the journey, because Iranian intelligence no longer trusted its own most powerful men with the location of their own leader. The paranoia had eaten the regime from the inside out. Ali Larijani, secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, one of the most powerful men in the entire country, was blindfolded, driven to the hideout, sat through a meeting with his own supreme leader, and then sent to Oman for diplomatic talks without ever being told where on earth he had just been. Security forces arrested over 700 people across Iran accused of spying for Mossad. But 700 arrests and the regime still could not find the leaks. Because the penetration was not a few traitors in a room, it was woven into the infrastructure of the country itself. Trump taunted him publicly, posting on Truth Social in June 2025 that America knew exactly where the supreme leader was hiding, that he was an easy target, and that they had simply chosen not to kill him yet. Words designed to do one thing: make a man who already could not sleep lose whatever peace he had left. Khamenei privately named 3 possible successors and told the assembly of experts to move immediately if he was killed. He reportedly told those close to him that he accepted assassination as martyrdom. The words of a man who was no longer planning for his life, but organizing the paperwork for his death. And through all of this, the bunker, the blindfolds, the isolation, the fear, Khamenei still projected an image of modesty to the Iranian people. His physician publicly declared that the supreme leader ate the cheapest fruits, repaired his own clothes, and insisted on simple meals. But behind that image, his doctors had prescribed him caviar and trout from the La River, luxuries shipped on schedule from the city of Rasht, while the citizens outside his walls stood in line for bread as the national currency disintegrated around them. He kept roughly 100 horses worth an estimated $40 million across 2 private stables, and when he traveled, his horses were flown ahead of him inside an Airbus A330, a man who preached austerity to his people while living a hidden life of extraordinary privilege. A Reuters investigation had already exposed the full scale. Khamenei secretly controlled a financial empire worth $95 billion through a shadowy organization called Setad, larger than the fortune of the last Shah, invisible to parliament, unknown to the people, untouched by any auditor in the country. He wrote poetry about sacrifice in a bunker furnished with secrets. He preached humility while his horses flew in private jets. And he told his people to endure sanctions while his caviar arrived on schedule. The most paranoid man in the Middle East was also its greatest performer. But while Khamenei hid underground and blindfolded his own officials and destroyed every phone within reach, Israeli intelligence had already been inside his world for years. Having hacked into nearly every traffic camera across Tehran and streaming encrypted footage live to servers in Tel Aviv. One camera near Pasteur Street gave analysts a direct view of where his bodyguards parked their personal cars each morning. And from that single angle, algorithms built a complete map of shift patterns, home addresses, commuting routes, and exactly which guards protected which commanders. American intelligence tracked every calling pattern across his associates' burner phone networks, tagging his real-time location without cracking a single device, while Mossad operatives recruited inside Iran reported on meetings that no satellite could ever see. The very cameras Iran had installed across Tehran to surveil its own citizens, to track protesters, to crush the people who marched against the regime, had been quietly turned against the regime itself. The tools built to oppress the Iranian people became the tools used to find and kill the man who oppressed them. On Friday night, February 27th, 2026, after years of hiding, months underground, weeks of blindfolding his own generals, and a lifetime of fear, Khamenei made the one decision that none of it could survive. He called a rare Saturday morning meeting and summoned his entire senior command to his compound in broad daylight. At 9:40 a.m. Tehran time on February 28th, 30 precision-guided bombs struck 3 buildings simultaneously. Khamenei in one, his generals in another, his Security Council in a third, all destroyed within 60 seconds. He was underground when the first bomb hit, but not deep enough, not inside either of the 2 hardened bunkers that might have saved him. And the 5-minute elevator ride that had once been his lifeline became the exact distance between the man and the only place that could have kept him alive. 48 senior Iranian leaders were killed that morning. And then the toll became personal. His daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchild, and his daughter-in-law were pulled from the rubble. And 2 days later, Mansoure, the 17-year-old bride who had married him 62 years earlier and never once left his side, died from her injuries without ever waking up. Being the target of the CIA and Mossad did not begin the morning the bombs fell. It began decades earlier, and by the time the missiles finally came, they were killing a man who had already lost almost everything that makes a life worth living. He lost the ability to hold his children without guards in the room. He lost the ability to see his grandchildren without scattering them across continents. He lost the ability to speak to another human being without wondering if they were reporting his words to Tel Aviv. He lost sleep. He lost sunlight. He lost the open sky. He spent his final months reading poetry underground by artificial light, writing notes by hand because he could not trust a phone, eating meals prepared under surveillance because he could not trust a kitchen, and governing a nation through a single messenger because he could not trust a signal. The CIA and Mossad did not just kill Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on February 28, 2026. They had been killing him slowly for years, dismantling his world piece by piece, stripping away every person, every comfort, every freedom, every connection, until the most powerful man in Iran was nothing more than an old man in a hole, writing poetry no one would read, waiting for a sound he would never hear.